From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Welston. Welcome now to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. Today marks 19 years since that clear September morning here in New York when commercial airliners were turned into weapons to attack the heart of Wall Street. The morning has been given over to events commemorating the day and the lives we lost. Welcome now one of the U.S. officials called upon that day to address some of the crisis as it unfolded. Harvey Pitt was the chairman of the Securities Exchange Commission when the markets were shaken to their core. He is now CEO of Kalorama Partners, and we welcome him back to Bloomberg. So, Mr. Pitt, thank you so much for joining us. Take us back to that day, if you will. Where were you when it happened? What was your immediate reaction?
Well, I was in my office preparing to go to New York City, and someone came in. It was very early in the morning, and told me that it appeared a prop jet or some small plane had lost its way and hit one of the World Trade Center towers. Obviously, within a short time after that, we understood that it was a big plane and it was a deliberate attack. And I never made it to New York that day. I had to defer my trip one day while we dealt with the chaos that was created by the attack.
So talk about that chaos for a moment, if you would, because obviously we lost power throughout southern Manhattan. A lot of the markets went down, and there was a lot of concern about the payment system, for example.
Yeah, the problem was that the damage that was done was quite extensive. My big concern was figuring out how extensive the damage was and what the protocols should be for getting the markets back into a normal state. We immediately decided to shut down the securities markets. I did that in tandem with Dick Grasso, who was then the chairman of the New York Stock Exchange and who became my constant telephone buddy throughout the week that we had to deal with the wreckage that was caused by the attack.
How could you get information in those first hours? Because I was running ABC News at the time, and one of the problems was we just couldn't get information out of anywhere.
We gathered information by talking. I talked directly to the heads of all the major firms. After we decided to shut everything down for the rest of the day, it was clear to me I had to go to New York City. And so I took a cadre of senior staff officials at the SEC along with Treasury officials and made plans to have the heads of all of the brokerage firms, not their delegates, but the heads personally, sit down with us in a meeting and try to figure out exactly what the damage was, exactly what kinds of issues had been raised, and also to hear from the New York mayors and New York governor's emergency divisions to find out about recovering people who had been lost in the wreckage.
One of the issues, obviously, when you shut down a market is it really shakes the market to its core. And then when you bring it back up, you worry about whether there'll be the confidence. And by the way, as much the liquidity there. What did you do to make sure that you could reopen these markets when you could reopen them and not have them go chaotic on you?
Yeah, one of the concerns we had was getting an accurate picture. At a time like this, there's understandably a fair amount of bravado. And that's why when we went to New York the very next morning, in addition to meeting with the heads of the firms and the heads of the then American Stock Exchange, New York Stock Exchange, and NASDAQ, We had people from Verizon and Consolidated Edison come in and brief us. There is no way to make sensible decisions without having a full portfolio of information on what the damage was. And what we learned was that pretty much 85% of the electronic communications had been disrupted, so that it became very, very difficult to foresee a prompt and immediate restoration of service. Instead, what we did was try to figure out all of the nuances and issues that would arise. And we met every day, usually twice a day, and we briefed the public every afternoon so that people were up to date on what our plans were. And finally, we decided we were pretty sure we could have the markets reopen on a Friday, or we could wait till the following Monday. I made the decision that we should wait till the following Monday because of my concern that if the markets tanked after we reopened them, we would never get confidence back. So it was crucial from our perspective that once the markets reopened, they remained reopened. And that's why we used the weekend to test, if you will, faux orders that weren't real, but that would test the electronics, the communications, and the like. And we got very good results. We found where all the kinks were in the system. And when the system reopened that Monday, we had record volume and there wasn't a single lost transaction, which was pretty incredible on the parts of all of the people who were working to make that a reality.
What was the volatility like? Was there a lot of gapping, for example?
I'm sorry?
What was the volatility like when you opened up on the 17th, I think was the date of that Monday?
Yeah, it was, the markets were clearly having been shut down for 6 days, which I think was the longest shutdown in history, certainly at least since World War II. The volatility was large. There was a huge influx of sell orders. People had been holding off on that. At the end of the day, there were certainly a lot of losses in particular securities. But the most important thing was that the markets functioned as they were meant to function. People's transactions were fulfilled and reported, and we didn't lose a single trade.
What did we learn from that? Have we changed some of the ways we structure the markets, our infrastructure, so that we'd be more resilient now if it happened again, heaven forfend?
We learned a great deal, I think. And one of the principal things that the Commission and also the Federal Reserve did together was we created a task force of senior staff people to prepare a report on lessons learned. This was not a report trying to point fingers at anybody or blame anyone, but rather it was a report that was designed to say, here are all the things that we were able to accomplish. Here are the lessons we've learned on how to minimize some of the problems we saw. And among those in particular was the lack of duplicative systems. One of the issues is that the New York Stock Exchange, for example, had created a duplicate system, but it was very close to where the original system was. So that if somebody were eager to take out the New York Stock Exchange again, they wouldn't have to go very far to take out its backup facilities.
Yeah.
We changed all of that and made certain that they did things differently going forward.
Harvey, really thank you so much for being with us on this very special day. That's Colorama Partners CEO Harvey Pitt. Coming up, potential Russian interference with the presidential election is back in the news. We talk with the man charged with investigating the last one. He's former FBI agent Peter Strzok. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. President Trump is playing hardball with the Chinese parent of TikTok. He's refusing to extend the September 15th deadline for ByteDance to sell off TikTok's U.S. operations. The president said if there's no sale by Tuesday, the U.S. will shut down TikTok for security reasons. Bloomberg's learned a sale is unlikely in time because new Chinese regulations complicated talks with bidders Microsoft and Oracle. In India, the coronavirus outbreak blew past Brazil's this week to become the world's second biggest. The country is recording close to 100,000 new cases every day. It now looks inevitable that India will soon also surpass the United States, the current number one. And in the U.S., the FDA is telling drug makers they'll have to meet a higher standard for an emergency authorization for a coronavirus vaccine. The agency will require more data than usual about how well the shot works. Career FDA officials are trying to reassure the public they will not give in to political pressure to approve a vaccine prematurely. The Pentagon has found that its 5-year budget plan for the F-35 falls short by about $10 billion. That's a new indication that the complex fighter jet may be too costly to operate and maintain. It's the first estimate for the nation's most expensive weapon system since the Pentagon overhauled its cost analysis unit in 2012. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you very much, Mark. A Microsoft investigation has found that a Russian-based group is trying to attack political campaigns just as we head to the election, echoing some of what we learned about the 2016 campaign. Peter Strzok was the FBI agent charged with investigating what happened back then when he worked as special counsel Robert Mueller's investigator. He became the center of a bitter battle with President Trump over allegations that he was biased against the Trump campaign, ultimately leading to his dismissal from the FBI, all of which he has written about in his new book, Compromised: Counterintelligence and the Threat of Donald J. Trump. And we welcome him now to Bloomberg. So, Mr. Strzok, thank you so much for being with us. As you read things like the reports about the Microsoft investigation, how much of it sounds similar to what we saw 4 years ago? How much of it's different?
Well, David, thanks for having me. Look, there's nothing in this report that is surprising. The Russians clearly demonstrated what they were trying to do in 2016, and they're back and they're doing the same broad efforts. They've adjusted their techniques. The things that I saw in that Microsoft report indicates to me that they're engaging in a lot more sort of brute force type activity. They're trying to break passwords by using massive combinations of potential variations rather than trying to trick people into providing it. They're not trying to hide their tracks when they do this. Similarly, the Chinese and the Iranians are also involved, as you'd expect. But all this points to a bigger issue. We saw what happened in 2016. Certainly within individual elements of the government, the FBI put together a team to kind of work across counterintelligence and cyber and criminal elements to look at the sort of malign foreign influence. But the problem is, the best and only way that the United States can effectively respond to this sort of attack is by a whole of government approach. And that's absolutely, as far as I can tell, been lacking. And evidence of that is clearly, former Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, when she attempted to bring up at the White House the need to have a centrally led response to this sort of foreign efforts, she was utterly shot down. She was told, don't even bring it up in front of President Trump because it's going to enrage him. The only way we're going to effectively protect ourselves going into November is by such a coordinated effort. And I'm deeply concerned that that isn't occurring and that we're not as well prepared as we should be.
And there's a whistleblower complaint right now by the former head of intelligence for DHS saying basically he was told not to worry about it too much. At the same time, Peter, as far as I can tell, there's pretty clear indication, evidence, proof perhaps, that the Russians really tried to interfere in the election last time. I'm not aware that they actually had an effect. Why do they keep doing it?
Well, they certainly did, and I think there was a consensus across the U.S. intelligence community in the report that was published in late 2016, where everybody, the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, and all agreed that the Russians were behind it. I would differ. It made a difference. I think when you look particularly, people would argue, well, it wasn't that large. But think about how close our elections were, particularly in the Electoral College context. 538 did a survey that showed that the number of voters to swing the election in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, and in Wisconsin would fit in one football stadium for one game. That number, 70, 80,000 people, you don't have to move the needle much at all. So I do think it made an impact. And in fact, I argue that it does. If you then transition to today, we're facing the very same thing. Almost everybody sees a very tight, contested election. Indeed, an election because of mail-in voting, we might not know who the winner is on election night. When you look at that environment and all the social tension that exists right now in the country, if I'm a foreign intelligence service, if I'm Russia, that's an extraordinarily ripe target to try and take advantage of. And I have every expectation that they are right now, and that they're only going to turn up those efforts as we get closer to November.
So Peter, as you recount in your book in some detail, you became the center of a real maelstrom, I think it's fair to say, where the President of the United States was even calling you a traitor, I think, at one point, to the country. And it was in part because of some communications you made that indicated that maybe you would just as soon not have him be president. Is that part of the problem, that when the investigator gets involved in something as important as an investigation of a presidential campaign, he or she has to be purer than Caesar's wife? And it gives the other side an opportunity to really distract and say, oh, wait a second, they're biased.
Yeah, that's a fair observation, and I understand that. And look, to be clear, I deeply, deeply regret the text messages. They were ill-advised. It was dumb to do it on a work phone, and that's something I'm going to regret for the rest of my life. Worst mistake of my life. Having said that, there have been multiple independent reviews of not only my actions, but everybody's actions. 2 Inspector General investigations, multiple U.S. attorneys looking at everything we did, multiple congressional investigations. And all of these folks have concluded at the end of the day that none of our actions, including mine, which were scrutinized up, down, left, and right, were ever impacted or demonstrated, any evidence of improper motives or bias. So I understand that criticism, and I can understand why people would ask that question, but I'd point them to the outside experts and independent folks who have looked at that.
A fair point, Peter. You're absolutely right. The Inspectors General basically found no evidence that influenced actually your conduct of the investigation. Let's talk about the here and now and the men and women in the FBI and other law enforcement, the career people who are there, as you were. You spent, was it 21 years?
Yes, just over 21 years.
21 years at the FBI. What is the situation there? Are people leaving the agency? Are they still committed to it? Are they discouraged? Are they prepared to follow a different direction?
Look, the men and women of the FBI that I know are there today, they are brave, fearless, and dedicated to upholding their oath to the Constitution. I can't help but be concerned when I see the pressure that this administration is placing, not only in the FBI, but across the government, that pressure can have an impact, a chilling impact on the day-to-day work. I think the FBI is holding. The people I talk to are as dedicated to their job as any that I've ever seen over the course of my entire career. I have profound concern that another 4 years of a Trump administration will really start to do lasting damage to our institutions well beyond what we've already seen.
Okay, thank you so much. Really appreciate your being with us today. That's former FBI agent Peter Strzok. He is author of the new book, Compromised. Still ahead, we're going to talk with former Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker, now advising the Biden-Harris campaign on economic policy. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David West, and it's time now for a market check. And for that, we turn to Scarlet Fu. So it looks like maybe we're going to get a quiet day at the end of the week, Scarlet? Maybe?
I don't know about that, David. It's a holiday-shortened week, but it feels much longer than that, given the wild swings that we've had. The tech correction, as you recall, began last Thursday, and it's still not over. If you look at how the major indexes are faring right now, the Nasdaq is underperforming, and all of that has changed the leadership. So you've got tech and communication services, the best performers all throughout the summer. They are the laggards over the last 2 weeks. So names like Apple, Alphabet, Facebook leading declines. Cyclicals, meantime, including apparel companies and materials, they are on the upswing over the last 2 weeks. So gone are the days when the S&P and Nasdaq made new highs. This week we've been down, we've been up, down, and now we're up again at the moment. For the week, the S&P 500 is headed for its first back-to-back weekly decline since May. Now, what's driving the swings? In the short term, you've got a couple of catalysts. Washington's inability to agree on more stimulus, as you've been covering for us. Next week's FOMC meeting as well, because the questions over how to implement the policy shift to lower for longer and a tolerance for higher inflation is taking place at the moment. And the buildup of bullish options activity on big tech names that are then capable of dragging the S&P and the Nasdaq with them wherever they go.
Well, Scarlett, let's pick up on that specifically, the bullish call options here. I think it was a week ago today, the Financial Times was saying really what caused all this turmoil in tech was because of SoftBank really coming in big. On the other hand, we also hear it's Robinhood investors. Do we know, or is it just a genuine rotation?
Well, there's a little bit of both, and the consensus seems to be that individual investors played a big role. SoftBank certainly was there. It's not clear who came first in terms of building up all those options positions, but it is clear that options activity helped drive those tech stocks to new highs over the summer, and specifically on a couple of names, right, like Apple and Tesla, which are increasingly bigger and bigger portions of the indexes that they're in, and those calls amplified moves to the upside. The question now is how much these options will drive the declines, and it's not really clear. There's still a lot of activity on a daily basis in options, so the volatility hasn't exactly flushed out traders. But volatility begets volatility, and it is likely that we'll see more swings as weekly, monthly, and quarterly options expire and people either re-hedge when their strike prices aren't met or they roll over their positions. In the broader market, David, when you look at the put-call ratio, it's holding near a 20-year low. So the lower the line, the fewer bearish options bets there are relative to bullish bets. And of course, you've got the extended political risk as well. The October futures contract for the VIX, much higher than that for the November and September contracts. So you can see a lot of concern there as we head towards November.
A couple of big events out there that you can hedge against, I guess. Thank you so much to Scarlet Fu for that report on the markets. Up next, Greg Valliere of AGF Investments is here to explain what happened to that fourth round of stimulus that we'd been promised. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. U.S. consumer prices rose for the third month in a row in August. The CPI was up 0.4%. The big factor, the sharpest gain in used vehicles since 1969. They rose 5.4%. Meanwhile, college tuition costs fell. Schools are turning to remote learning because of the coronavirus pandemic. Russia, Chinese, and Iranian hackers have stepped up efforts to disrupt the U.S. election. That's according to a report from Microsoft. The company says hackers have targeted both the Trump and the Biden campaigns. It warned that other targets include political parties, advocacy groups, and academics. China denies the allegations and says Microsoft shouldn't be making things out of nothing. The UK has secured a trade deal with Japan. It's the country's first major post-Brexit accord and a boost to Prime Minister Boris Johnson as negotiations with the European Union deteriorate. UK Minister for Trade Policy Greg Hands spoke with Bloomberg about the agreement.
We've just signed a major trade deal with Japan. I think people can have confidence in the UK government, confidence in the UK's approach overall. But it is also really important for us to secure our own internal market. I think if we didn't secure our own internal market, I think financial markets would take alarm.
The UK says 99% of exports to Japan will be tariff-free under the deal, which will add £5.2 billion to annual trade between the two nations. And news out this hour, SoftBank is considering changes to its options trading strategy. That's according to people familiar with the matter. SoftBank executives met with investors about this and said that the strategy is not risky. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. As time goes on, that fourth round of fiscal stimulus seems to be further and further off in the distance. To explain what's going on, we welcome now Greg Valliere. He is Chief U.S. Policy Strategist with AGF Investments. Greg, if anybody can explain this, you can. I must say, the longer I watch it, the more I think neither side, Republican or Democrat, really want another round of stimulus.
Yeah, it's really a very confusing story, David. Nice to talk to you. I think that the president would like another stimulus bill. He feels it could help the economy, which could help his reelection prospects. But both parties are so far apart. I think it's unlikely we'll get anything. If the economy starts to flatten out, which is possible, maybe we talk about a stimulus bill during the winter, but I think anytime soon is pretty unlikely.
But a stimulus bill in the winter is not going to help anybody running for office on November 3rd, particularly some of those Republican senators. So let's turn to the election right now. Where are we right now? The polls seem to be reasonably stubborn, actually, between former Vice President Biden and President Trump.
Yeah, it depends on the criteria. If you want to look at the national overall poll, I think Biden's ahead by 7 or 7.5 points. If, on the other hand, you want to look at the key states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Florida, it's closer. I think the key states are probably more like 3 or 4 points, but also for Biden.
So let's talk about the possibilities of either a Trump presidency, second term, or a first-term Biden presidency. Who would that affect in the markets as a practical matter? Which companies, what sectors is it likely to affect, positively or otherwise?
Yeah, I think it's a big deal. I think if Biden wins, obviously it's positive for alternative energy. I think he would be more inclined to be moderate on trade. Business might like that. On the other hand, yeah, I think if Biden wins, this would not be a good story for defense. I think defense could get a leveling off of spending increases. It would not be necessarily a good deal for financial services, which might see more regulations. It certainly wouldn't be a good deal for fossil fuels, which would see a lot of the Trump regulatory reform undone. So there are some big plays based on certain sectors.
And cutting across all those sectors is the question of taxation, because the former vice president has made no secret of the fact he wants to spend a lot of money and he's willing to tax a fair amount, particularly corporations and what he would call the wealthier.
Isn't that the truth? You look at taxes, David, my lord, you've got higher individual taxes, higher corporate taxes, corporate minimum tax, higher capital gains tax, higher estate tax, a Wall Street transaction tax. So, yes, I think that is an opening for Trump in the next 2 months if he proclaims, not that Biden lacks mental acuity, I think that's not going to get traction, but I think Trump can claim that the Biden agenda would mean much, much higher taxes.
Let's talk about one other possibility, which I'm reluctant even to raise, which is we don't have an answer on November 3rd. That, in fact, this is a protracted contest, particularly because we have so many mail-in ballots that apparently are going to be cast this year. And everybody's filing lawsuits already. We haven't even cast the votes, and they're filing lawsuits. What happens to the markets? What happens to the economy, for that matter, if we're into December or even beyond?
It's a bigger and bigger story for the markets in the last few weeks. 3 scenarios very quickly. One would be, could there be a postponement? I don't see it. Congress would have to do that, and they can't agree on anything. Number 2, could it be days or even weeks before we know who actually won? Yeah, I mean, I don't rule that out. Counting all these mail-in ballots, it took New York State 6 weeks to decide who won primaries this summer. And number 3, by far the most ominous scenario, what if Trump barely loses? He loses Pennsylvania or Arizona by a tiny amount. He's virtually declared that he would consider this fraudulent because of mail-in ballots. I think that Trump would contest this in the courts. And just as we saw in the year 2000, the Supreme Court resolved the election it could happen again.
So, Greg, as I said, and we all have to take polling with a grain of salt because we've all been burned one point in our career or another by polls. At the same time, the margin, the national margin, and even some of the battleground states, has been reasonably stubborn at this point, and there appears to be not that many undecided voters this time around. So, as you look forward to this, what could shake things up? And let me ask you quite specifically, because I don't remember, do debates make a difference?
Yes, and you make a very good point. I think most Americans have already made up their minds. But the debate, the first one is September 29. I think it's a really big deal. The White House, I think, has set the bar so low for Joe Biden, saying, he can't make a subject and a verb agree, and he's addled. If Biden shows up and does even moderately well, I think people would say, he's fine, he's okay. So I think that both candidates are going to get a thorough inspection on the 29th of September. I would submit to you that starting on the 30th of September, the outcome of this election could look a lot clearer.
That's fascinating. Yeah, low expectations are almost always our friend. Thank you so much to Greg Valliere. He is Chief U.S. Policy Strategy with AGF Investments. Coming up here, President Trump is behind former Vice President Biden in most of the polls, except when it comes to the economy. We talk with one of the people advising Mr. Biden on economic policy, Penny Pritzker. She is, of course, former Secretary of Commerce. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Former Vice President Biden has been speaking out this week on his plans for the economy, and in particular going to Warren, Michigan, home of a plant General Motors had closed but had to reopen to make surgical masks. For an analysis of Mr. Biden's economic plans, particularly for manufacturing workers in battleground states like Michigan, we welcome now Penny Pritzker, former U.S. Commerce Secretary under President Obama and founder and chairman of PSP Partners. Ms. Pritzker, thank you so much for being with us. It's great to have you. So, Madam Secretary, give us a sense of what Joe Biden's pitch is to those auto workers in Michigan and also manufacturing people in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania to say, I'm going to be better for you than Donald Trump's been.
Well, the first thing that Joe Biden's going to do is deal with the virus, which is really important. He has a plan to listen to the facts, listen to the scientists, and listen to the experts so that we can get this virus behind us. That's important for stability, for certainty, and for planning and investment going forward. The second thing that's important to the workforce in any state in this country is that Joe Biden plans to invest in our workers. He believes in workforce training and education as essential for our workers to adapt as we become more and more of a digitized society. And then he wants to make investments in innovation, in R&D, and clean energy. And that's important because those are industries where the United States needs and can win globally. And so that's an incredibly important for job creation and for job sustainability. And finally, he wants to strengthen the social safety net, which is essential for all of us as we transfer between jobs, which seems to be more of a norm than it was, let's say, 10, 20 years ago.
So those all sound like potentially good, sensible projects that would be beneficial, but they're sort of in the medium and longer range. It's not immediate. How do you compete with a president who says, I'm helping in the here and now by beating up on China that's taking your jobs?
Well, I think, first of all, let's talk about China. The thing China is afraid of is whether we're going to get our act together and actually grow our domestic economy and have a real competitiveness plan. What I just outlined, investing in R&D, investing in innovation, investing in clean energy, is about us being competitive globally in 5G and AI and quantum, in the areas that we need to win in the long term. And so this is all extremely important. The other thing is that Joe Biden will rebuild multilateral relationships so that we hold China accountable for the abuses they have in the global economy. So I think that Joe Biden is a much better president for American competitiveness, for American jobs than Donald Trump. And what I don't understand, and I've really struggled with this, David, and you and I have talked about it, is, I don't get this idea that Donald Trump has, rhetoric that he's made promises and he's kept his promises. I mean, the litany of promises not kept goes on and on for me. He promised us greater job growth than President Obama. Prior to the pandemic, he did not deliver that. He promised us 4% GDP growth and we got 2.5% GDP growth before the pandemic. He promised to bring back manufacturing jobs. And prior to the pandemic, our manufacturing jobs were at the lowest level since 2009. He promised to slash regulations more than any president in history. And his own White House Office of Regulatory Affairs said that those moves that he's taken are economically insignificant. He promised us more foreign direct investment than ever. And in fact, foreign direct investment's been at its lowest level in decades. He promised us our trade deficit would go down. And in fact, our trade deficit in July was at an all-time high. He promised us he'd bring back jobs from overseas. And instead, the rate of offshoring by federal contractors has nearly doubled under President Trump. So I don't understand why. I just don't get it. I don't get why there's a belief he's going to be able to restore our economy. Joe Biden has done this before. He had to do it during the Great Recession, and he'll do it again.
So, Madam Secretary, I mean, you have a rich history in commercial real estate, but you also have a foot certainly in the technology camp, both because of your time as Secretary of Commerce, but also on the board of Microsoft. Does Joe Biden have a significant difference from President Trump in his approach to China on technology? I'll give you two examples. TikTok, whether TikTok really is a threat to us or not, and also a Microsoft actually report that was reported on today about possible tampering by foreign governments, including some based in China, with our elections.
Well, look, the tampering that's been reported is extremely important. It means that our elections are at risk. And how can it be? We knew we had a problem in 2016. That was reported. What happened? What actions did the president take during the past 4 years in order to make our elections safer? There's no greater threat to our democracy than not being able to have a safe election. This is the kind of lack of management, lack of leadership, lack of clarity and lack of embracing challenges that this president has not done. And that's not fair to the American people. And that's why we need a change.
And are we threatened by TikTok and the Chinese access to data?
You know, I really can't comment on TikTok being on the Microsoft board and Microsoft obviously being involved in that potential situation. So I'm not going to, talk about that. But what I will say is that I think Joe Biden will be concerned and focused on making sure that our national security is safe. He will bring our allies back into the fold. We'll deepen those relationships again, as opposed to threatening them. And that's what's essential in terms of fighting China. We can't do it alone. Whether it's TikTok or some other technology, you could ban it or do whatever in one country. But if it exists in other countries, and we're not acting together with our allies, how effective is our policy going to be?
Let me ask you finally about commercial real estate. I can't let you go, given your background in commercial real estate, and specifically tied back into the campaign in some sense. What's the situation with commercial real estate right now? Because we have had this pandemic and this recession, and how would it differ under a President Biden versus a President Trump?
Well, unfortunately, we're in a situation now that we didn't need to be in, as we know, because we've just been revealed this week, these issues of the federal government, and the president knew about the pandemic and its threats along and didn't act early and did not bring the power of his office and the power of the federal government to bear early. So we're all paying the price for that. And the most people are paying the biggest price are the human lives and the human toll that's being felt. And I see that here in Illinois. As it relates to commercial real estate, this is a tough time for certain parts of the real estate industry. Industrial real estate is continuing to do very well. But that's because we're making a change. We're moving from more in-store retail to more e-commerce. And that means we need to revise and reform our supply chains. And so that means there's a lot of demand in the industrial real estate sector for new product that fits this new type of supply chain that we've got and that's necessary for e-commerce. Take on the other side, retail real estate, real challenge. You're seeing retail companies going bankrupt and you're seeing tenants going bankrupt, which means all of that is going to need to be reconfigured and repositioned. Real challenge for the retailers. And then in between, you see multifamily apartment buildings and things like that. Right now, housing in general is a challenge. Some places are seeing massive increases in prices of housing because people are moving there temporarily in order to ride out the pandemic, versus the inner cities and major metropolitan areas have less occupancy right now because people have moved out into be away from more densely populated areas. I think that will recover. I think that's a question of time. Those companies that are well capitalized will do well.
Madam Secretary, always a treat to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time. That's Penny Pritzker. She's former U.S. Commerce Secretary and founder and chairman of PSP Partners. Coming up, AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka joins us to talk about the presidential candidate's plans for organized labor. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Former Vice President Biden appeared this week at a virtual event with AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka. And the Vice President said he would be the, quote, strongest labor president you've ever had. To unpack what this could mean, we welcome now Mr. Trumka himself, whose organization represents over 12.5 million workers. So, Richard, welcome. It's always great to have you with. You were there. You heard him say it. What did he mean?
Just let me say this. Donald Trump campaigned as a friend of working people, but his rhetoric doesn't match his reality. He's actually been very, very anti-worker, anti-union. Joe Biden, on the other hand, said he will be the best friend that we ever had. He supports the Right to Organize Act, which would modernize the labor laws. He understands the importance of creating jobs. He really will invest in infrastructure and put us back to work. And when we do that, he'll also insist on prevailing wages, so that the wages in the country go up, not down the way they've been going. Because our outdated labor laws no longer serve as an effective means for working people to have our voices heard. So that's one of the major differences. They'll also support and redo OSHA. Right now, OSHA is a cadaver. It's charged with protecting our health and safety. It has fewer inspectors than we've ever had. MSHA, which is supposed to protect minors, is the same. It's a cadaver. He will actually protect our health and safety and do so seriously. He'll be a friend. He's pledged to expand OSHA and MSHA and enforce and increase the number of investigators and inspectors at both agencies.
So, Richard, when you talk about modernizing the labor laws, I'm curious about what that really means. And it won't be lost to you. We have some conservatives now stepping up and saying we need to do something for the organized labor. We had this statement out of Compass that was signed by Marco Rubio and Pete Sessions, people like that. So what does that mean exactly? Does that make it easier to organize?
Well, them signing the statement, I think, is a recognition that working people are no longer going to take a seat in the back of the bus. That we do have power when we come together, and we're going to exercise that power. They know that workers really have been put in the back of the bus. In most cases, both of them have been responsible for trying to keep us there. They're now saying that we can't do that any longer because it actually threatens the system itself. We're on a trajectory. This system is on a trajectory to implosion if it doesn't open up and start serving the needs of more and more people rather than less and less. And I think that statement is a recognition by them that they know that we're on a trajectory to implosion.
So, Richard, as you know so terribly well, it doesn't look like we're going to get a fourth round of fiscal stimulus at least anytime soon. There seems to be this continuing impasse in Washington. Is part of the problem that the labor numbers seem to be getting a little bit better as we get the jobless claims and things like that? We hear maybe there's only 800,000 people unemployed. What do you make of the jobless numbers?
Well, first of all, let me correct that. Total unemployment insurance claims rose for the fourth straight week to 1.7 million. There's two facets to unemployment numbers. One is the regular unemployment number, now is 884,000, and then the other is the pandemic unemployment assistance. That's people who wouldn't qualify for unemployment insurance because they're independent contractors or gig workers, if you will, and that's another 835,000. So last week was the 25th straight week where total initial claims were far greater than the worst week in the Great Recession in 2008. And here's something you need to keep an eye on, David. Mitch McConnell allowed the across-the-board $600 increase in unemployment benefits to expire 6 weeks ago. You're now starting to see the telltale signs of that. You're starting to see jobless claims increase because that spending, that money, that demand that was created by that $600 spending among millions of people is wearing out. So what we're seeing, you're seeing fewer jobs that were created. The job pace is slowing. You saw fewer jobs added in August than in July, and you saw far fewer than were in June. So we're starting to see a slowdown of that, and the effects of them not doing a stimulus are starting to take a toll on the American people and the American economy.
Richard, it's always such a great pleasure to have you. Thank you for being with us. That's Richard Trumka. He is president of the AFL-CIO. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk with Carly Fiorina about U.S. tech policy toward China and the first woman to run a major global bank. In the meantime, we continue to recognize the 19th anniversary of 9/11, and former Vice President Biden is about to give some remarks, I believe, in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.